Welcome to the session on automating data entry in DP2. My name is Pat DeLuca, and my partner in crime this afternoon is Tom Apeland.
Thank you for inviting me today.
You're welcome. So we're going to be talking about automating data entry in DP2 version 20.2. Some of what you're going to hear is these are things that have been around for a while. I'm going to revisit them very briefly. And then we're going to focus on some of the new functionality, or not brand new, but is ever improving, and we think will really add to some of the workflows that you have in your lab. So I'd kind of like to have you look at them from a different point of view. So I just want to remind you that this is a session that will also have Q&A. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of Tom when we get to that point in the presentation. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the command processor. And the reason that we want to talk about it is because we really just kind of do a little bit of compare and contrast. We're going to talk about this is the old way, and you may be automating a lot of your workflows using the command processor, and I want to make sure to point out that you don't have to change anything. You can do exactly what you're doing today, but we have some ideas for you. So I'm just going to briefly, for those of you who have never used the command processor, you're not automated, or maybe you're have a different role in your lab, we just want to kind of give you a sense of what's possible and where things are happening. So on the import taskbar in DP2, we have the entry is called commands, and that opens, which a lot of you will be familiar with who have automated, the process commands dialog box. So process commands, which has been around, I think, since the beginning.
Yep.
I don't remember ever seeing it not there.
2000.
2000, but we haven't been here that long.
Yeah, we have.
So the process commands, or command import, as it's kind of commonly known. Essentially what it's doing is it automates the processing of KPL command scripts. And if you're not familiar with that, KPL is the Kodak programming language. And
Kodak Professional.
Thank you. As I said it, I'm thinking, wait, which I've probably said 1,000 times. It's Kodak Professional language. And the beauty of this is that it allows you to automate information out of other systems into DP2 and have DP2 act accordingly, regardless of what it is you're trying to do. So some of the attributes of the command importer, if you're not using it, it can run on more than one system. You can run more than one at a time. Essentially what it does is it looks at a folder or a directory, and the command files from other systems are placed into that directory, and the process commands dialog box just acts on whatever's in there. It runs kind of in the background on a low thread, on a thread at low priority, so you can continue to work. It's not the kind of thing that is going to use so much system resource that it's going to interrupt other work that you're doing. One of the things to note, and one of the things that we're going to be comparing kind of against, is that once a command file is acted upon by the command processor in DP2, it's automatically deleted, although you can change that. There's a system setting that you could change. But they go away. They're done. The file goes, it goes away, the process is over. If there's an error, that file is placed in an error folder inside the directory that the command processor is reading. So it's a pretty straightforward process, and we said it's been around for a while. So if you're using the command importer or customized import strategy, what we want to say is continue to do so. It's simple, it's not intrusive, it works well for a lot of applications. But one of the drawbacks, and we are kind of at the end of our piece, we're going to do a lot to compare and contrast. Tom's got a whole chart on the pros and cons of doing either one of these. And so that was something that we wanted to kind of address, right? And some of the things, other features and other systems that were enabled in DP2 in the last couple of years have really created an opportunity to give you more and to kind of add value to the chains that you were already working. So this is what a command looks like. It's just, if you haven't seen it, it's pretty simple. It's based on some very basic systems in DP2, the commands.txt. So if you're not a programmer and you're a lab owner, essentially what they're doing is they're writing a file that says add order, add image, add order item. But that commands, there's quite a few of them. And over the years, they've been added to and changed, as they've needed to. So it's a pretty robust way of doing things. This piece of it is the same, essentially. What you'll be doing or what's happening is it's using that same set of logic, that same set of scripting, but we're going to be using it, or have been using it actually for the last 3 years, I think, right? 3 or 4 years? The workers?
You're referring to the workers, yeah, about
Yeah.
2012
Yeah.
or so, yeah.
So a lot of the labs that I've talked to have said, oh, no, that's just for remote ordering. And so this is one of the things that we want to talk to you about, and is really the focal point of what we're doing this afternoon. I think it's this afternoon in California. I'm not sure anymore. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Not quite.
Yeah, it's lunchtime. So we're going to be talking about workers and work queues. And as I said, it's based on all of the things that you already know, but it's going to give you a lot more capacity to do things in a different way that we think will help you. So the first thing that I want to kind of just as in a general way, workers and work queues are part of the same sort of overall workflow or process. And it's really what we're trying to do is kind of leverage the power of DP2 and the database in a new way that's going to give you more control. It's going to give you the opportunity to understand better what's happening and interact with it. So at a very high level, what happens is the work comes into the queue, and it's essentially a table. This is DP2, right? So it's essentially a table. And those workers are looking at that queue or a series of queues. There's a lot of flexibility in the way this is built in order to act on whatever the scripts or commands are that you're using in your workflow. So this is just a little bit more about the queues. So what you're going to be what you can be thinking about in this type of automation is not just increasing your productivity, but being able to manage it in a different way. So you can have multiple queues. The queues can be organized based on your workflow. They can be organized. I think probably the most common way of using them now is the labs that are doing remote ordering. But you could set up queues to do really work from other systems, work from within your own system, depending on whether or not you have proprietary systems in your lab that you want to think about being able to handle in this way. So the other piece of this is, of course, the workers. And the workers are really kind of very little robust agents that are looking for work in the queue. And what's very different about the way that these work is that these not only can these happen from anywhere, so you can manage the queues from anywhere, you can start them from anywhere. They can be looking at different, queues. They can look at one queue. You can look at all queues. You can separate your work into different queues, as I said before. So it's really allowing you to manage your load and your workload from kind of wherever you need to in your lab in a way that is best suited to whichever workflow you're trying to address. So I think for a lot of labs, it's going to be a huge advantage if you can really think about how would you want to organize your work and what would you want to do in order to be able to organize it. So a little bit more about the workers themselves. They can run on multiple threads. So I've had a couple of different programmers in labs say, this is great. I can do whatever I want. I can use the power of the processors. I can decide where in my lab that power is going to be utilized. I can put workers to do certain things on certain systems. I can really kind of take a look at my overall network in my lab because, again, this is really the benefit of that whole client-server relationship is the ability to manipulate what's happening. And you can pause them, you can restart them. There's a lot of different functionality here that we just don't have in the command processor. So work queues, one of the kind of very high level concepts around the work queues is the amount of stuff you can do and see. You can understand and respond to errors, right? You can see why it errored out. You can see what the description of what it was doing in the first place. So it really gives you easy access to all kinds of information within the database that's also stored until it's deleted, depending on what your workflow is, so that as a production manager, you can really get a sense of what's happening and manage it accordingly. So this is the features, the compare and contrast. This is really the pros and cons of using one as opposed to the other. And I'm going to kind of let Tom speak to
Sure.
this chart.
So I put this together to kind of help you decide if I'm doing something new, would I use a command importer or would I try using the workers? And of course, you consider, changing old stuff to use the workers if you want, but there's some fundamental differences in the two, and I think if you understand them, it'll help you choose one or the other. The biggest difference is how we queue stuff. One is files in a directory, and the others is records in a database. So when your files in a directory, there's not too much you get to do, right? You can't control priority. You pretty much have files in there. The only thing we can do is guarantee to execute them in the order that they were submitted to the directory. In the case of the database, because we have a record in the database that describes this queue entry, we're able to allow you to set a priority field, which will help us choose which one to run next. You can actually embed both code as well as data in that database record. So as an example, if you were taking in work from another system and that work came in as XML, you might put the XML in as the data. And the code would be whatever code you need to parse that XML and actually create the order in DP2. So that can all be stored in the queue and operate together. One of the biggest ones for us when we were working on KC2 is the ability to retry stuff. So if you think about what we're doing is we're doing a lot of work in DP2, but then we're talking to the web. We're either publishing something out to the web or getting something back, and the web's not always up. So you want something that will wait and retry when the web's back up. And the workers have that stuff built in steroids. The other thing is the whole concept of parallel processing. Workers let you create batches of work. So for instance, back in KC2 again, when I'm publishing catalog, I'll create all the different products and all the different assets that describe the products. And only if all those are successful would I ever want to publish that catalog out to the web. So by breaking this into small steps, I'm actually able to get multiple workers working on the same batch at once. So instead of just one thread of execution creating all these products and publishing the catalog, as many as are available, or at least as many as that I've assigned to that queue, are able to work on this thing in parallel. Now, if you think about that, well, I'd like to create all those products at once, but I don't want to publish any of them if any of them fail. So we need some method of synchronization, which we have built in. So there's ways to say that, well, I'm not allowed to go on and do the next step until all previous steps have completed completely. So the act of creating the products would be done on many workers, but none of them would start publishing until they all succeeded. The other thing that we didn't like about command importers is, when you would call up and say I had a problem, what workstation did it run on? Can we get the session logs from that place and so on? So we decided with workers we were going to have remote control of the workers. Because it's in the central database, any workstation can gain access to the information that's in there. So you can start them, you can stop them, you can tell them to change queues, you can tell a machine to add more workers because things are getting busy and you want to ramp up the parallelism in the system. You can stop workers. It can be done from any workstation, and especially when your workers might be running on VMs, especially even VMs that don't even have monitors or you're not logged into routinely. There's also debugging features built in. So if something fails, you can step right into it. It'll jump right into an editor and let you see the code. It was built to be easy to debug. And statistics are kept. We keep track of when was something submitted, when did it start, when did it finish, how many times have we retried it. how long did it take, those kind of things are available. Let's go to the next slide there.
Okay.
Error reporting is also a natural part of this. Since it's a database record, we can easily write error information right into the record and make that available. One thing that's also interesting is I can have a worker, normally with a command importer I say watch a certain directory. And with a command importer I can say, watch a certain queue. But I can also have some number of workers that are willing to watch all queues. So these can kind of be like cleanup guys. So I've got a fair amount of dedicated workers, but I can have some workers that just sit around and look for any kind of work from any queue. There's one downside to the workers in that there's slight amount of extra overhead when we execute these things, because we execute from a file. So when I'm running a command importer, I'm actually just executing that file as it exists on disk. As with a worker, I have to do it slightly different. I have to get the data out of the database record, get it written to a file, and then execute it. So a slight amount more overhead there. Not something I think you'll notice, but the decision of which job to run next is much more efficient with workers than it is with command importers. If I throw 1,000 files into a command importer's directory, well, I've got to walk through that whole directory and figure out which one has the oldest date before I can run it. So every time I want to run another file, I've got to walk through that whole directory. Whereas with workers, I just do a little query of the database and I get the next one. I think we've talked about the next several ones.
Okay.
One last one here is the little command importer window just has like a little 1 or 2 line status. What am I doing right at the moment? It flashes by you so quickly you can barely see it. So with the workers, what we did is we put in a scrollable window. So the history that you're seeing in that window, which is controllable, you can have logging levels that report more or less detail. That's all sitting there so you can go back and look and see what happened and scroll through it. So those are the major differences.
Okay. I think we can open it up for questions. We're just right at about that time, so our timing's pretty good.
Alrighty.
So now we have to unmute our computers and use our headsets. And at this point, Eric, are there questions? I know. Just
But don't unmute your microphones.
Right. Got the, yes. That's the only one you got to do. Yep.
Does the adjust images SMH contrast work with Wheelman?
Oh, there's that one. That's the last session. I don't see why not. I haven't tried it, though. I'll be honest with you, I haven't tried it. It does work in adjust images. If you got to change mode, I think. I'd actually have to run that, but I think you'd have to change mode because you'd have to, yeah. Because contrast, saturation, and gamma is on a separate mode on the Wheelman, I think. You like it? I'm pretending I know what I'm doing.
Where can we find the XML specs for the workers?
We don't have a specific spec for the XML. Now we do with KC2. An XML file comes back and we have code that parses it. But if you have your own private XML document that we know nothing of, you'll have to write your own code that imports that thing.
And Spot, Alan, go ahead. Or it might be Jerson or Marisa if it's at RPL.
Oh, it's me. Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, I will say ahead of time, I'm an engineer that is just barely dipping my toe into DP2, so these might be some elementary questions, but I just wanted to get overall stuff. The worker queue, the code is sitting inside the table?
That's correct. When you queue something, you write a record, and the code is actually placed in a field in that record.
Okay, is there the option, or have you considered the option of having the source for that code sitting in flat files so that we can use existing versioning control solutions? In our situation, that would be Git.
I'm not sure what you mean there. The source is whatever you stuff in there.
Well, no, I understand. I mean, if we have multiple engineers and my area primarily consists of more public-facing web services, but we have to communicate with DP2 significantly. It would be nice if I didn't have to give my team all access to like the DP2 interface, for example. If they were able to just edit flat files like they normally do, and we could put those on our private GitHub repos and manage them that way for just accessibility and redundancy and things like that. That would make things a lot easier than actually having to edit. I mean, obviously, they would obviously be in a familiar development environment as well, as opposed to have to do it in the DP2 UI.
You're not normally going to be doing it in the DP2 UI. We're talking about external programs, feeding us work. Instead of writing a file to a directory, you're writing a record to a database. So whatever you write, is totally under your control.
Okay, so if I'm using Atom as an IDE or Sublime, is there a plugin that will write that directly to the queue table?
No. So that's the disadvantage of the workers over a command importer, is that it might take you a little more programming expertise to get the data in there.
I gotcha. Okay.
But normally you're not going to be sitting in an editor creating these files. I mean, we really intended this for a programmatic generation of the data.
I gotcha. Okay. One other question, actually two, but real quick. The queues themselves, I get the impression that they're segregated based on obviously what you want the items in the queues to run on. Are those like preset things? Like if we want to do this, we put these worker items in this queue, or are they like event driven that we can say we want this queue to pretty much fire when these specific events happen, and then the workers will take the stuff out of the queue and run them, or how are they segregated?
So they're watching the database for work, and when it shows up and it's ready, we execute it. So if you have some event, you're going to, at the time of that event, write a record to the database.
Okay. Now, I heard you mention that there were multiple queues and you could watch all of them. So my confusion is, why are there multiple queues?
You might have a queue for some other data entry method.
Okay, well, that's really about it. Oh, yeah, one last thing, which I probably know the answer to. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to ask that, because I think you've already answered it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and we have another one from Kate Dempsey. Kate, go ahead.
With the worker queue as opposed to the commands importer, can you pause something that's importing and then possibly delete it? Say you realize that it's wrong as it's importing. Normally with commands importer, we just have to wait until the entire thing imports and then delete it. Would we be able to stop it and delete it?
Yep, you could do that. You could pause a worker, or you could disable something in the queue, or just delete it right out of the queue.
And then I have one other question. When we have a problem with the commands importer where we are trying to import names with accents, and they're in the text file correctly, and we can paste them into DP2 correctly, but they won't import correctly into DP2 through the commands importer. Do you think that would be better with a worker?
It should be the same. Now, whether or not those types of characters are making it into DP2 based on how you wrote the file. In other words, it might be a file that requires 2 bytes per character instead of 1. Or the code that you're executing may not do well with some of those special care. But it's nothing to do with the actual worker itself.
Okay.
We recently went through a bunch of those fixes with KC2 because we had some areas where French characters weren't coming in well. So we did make those fixes, but it had nothing to do with a worker or a command importer.
And we have another question from Anya. Anya, go ahead.
Oh, I think that was me, Lucas.
Oh, hi, Lucas. You can go too.
So maybe, could you maybe run through an example of how you would add a record to the queue to execute code? Because there's a lot of stuff in that table. Setup, queue name, parent, batch ID, all that. Like, what do you need to include when you add a new record to the table?
So I think what you're referring to is there's a bunch of fields in here. And not very many of them are required for you. Primarily, you need to get a queue name, a batch ID, and the code. The code is right over here under what's called an action. So there's not a lot of things to insert. The rest of these things get populated as we process the work. You can put a description in also, which just kind of makes it easy to look through and find something. Now, if you were in DP2, or let's say you wrote some code in DP2, we do have some helpers. I don't know if people can see this or not.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Can you guys see that clearly or not?
Okay.
Might be able to make this bigger. Yeah, I can. Here we go. So in DP2, or in KC2, when we want to queue something up from DP2, we have a class called base queue work. And basically, you create the code you want to execute. Here, I'm just doing one of those add orders and including commands. And then there's a couple methods that will do it for you. And that'll take care of making sure that all the fields are populated. So you essentially create the object, call the new method. You can call that many times if you're adding multiple batches, and then you just commit it, and that's all it takes. If you're doing it from your own program, this is quite a talent, being able to hear myself. The batch ID needs to be unique. So if you're generating your own, just stick something in front of it. You know, make your lab name and a number or whatever. Ours are just numbers that increment. So any kind of letter in front of it will make it unique. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully it was helpful.
Can you discuss the difference between using remote work steps versus parent batch ID and after batch ID in remote work?
Yeah.
We have about a minute.
Okay, I'm going fast. So in addition to a bunch of things in one batch, you can see these have batch IDs, but they're all part of a bigger parent batch. And these can run in parallel, so multiple workers can work on the individual components of the batch. But if I want one of these to have its own separate steps, I can write to the work step table and do the same thing, add the code and the data. And when it's time to run this one, it'll run each of those steps in order and won't go on until it's finished them. So it's another level of breakdown in putting a multi-step batch together.
And I think that's probably it. We've got about 10 seconds. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with us.